Book 3. About gods, then, I said. Such, it seems, are the things that should and should not be heard from childhood on, by men who would honor gods and ancestors, and not take lightly their friendship with each other. And I, he said, suppose our impression is right. And what if they are to be courageous? Mustn't they also be told things that will make them fear death least? Or do you believe that anyone who has this terror in him would ever become courageous? By Zeus, I don't, he said. What about this? Do you suppose anyone who believes Hades' domain exists and is full of terror will be fearless in the face of death, and choose death in battles above defeat and slavery? Not at all. Then concerning these tales, too, it seems we must supervise those who undertake to tell them, and ask them not simply to disparage Hades' domain in this way, but rather to praise it, because what they say is neither true nor beneficial for men who are to be fighters. Indeed we must, he said. Then we'll expunge all such things, I said, beginning with this verse. I would rather be on the soil, a serf to another, to a man without lot whose means of life are not great, than rule over all the dead who have perished. And this, lest his house appear to mortals and immortals, dreadful, moldy, and even the gods hate it, and, oh woe, so there is in Hades' house too, both soul and phantom, but no mind in it at all. And this, he alone possesses understanding, the others are fluttering shadows. And the soul flew from his limbs and went to Hades, wailing his fate, leaving manliness and the bloom of youth. And this, under the earth like smoke went the gibbering soul, and, like bats who in a corner of an enchanted cave, fly gibbering when one falls off, the cluster hanging from the rock, and rise holding on to each other, so they went together gibbering. We'll beg Homer and the other poets not to be harsh if we strike out these and all similar things. It's not that they are not poetic and sweet for the many to hear, but the more poetic they are, the less should they be heard by boys and men who must be free, and accustomed to fearing slavery more than death. That's entirely certain. And we must, further, also throw out all those terrible and fearful names applied to this domain. Cocytus, Styx, those below, the withered dead, and all the other names that are part of this model, and which make all those who hear them shiver, as is thought. Perhaps they're good for something else, but we fear that our guardians, as a result of such shivers, will get hotter and softer than they ought. And, he said, our fear is right. Then they must be deleted? Yes. Must the model opposite to these be used in speaking and writing? Plainly? Will we then take out the laments and wailings of famous men, too? If, he said, what went before was necessary, so is this. Now consider whether we'll be right in taking them out or not, I said. We surely say that a decent man will believe that for the decent man, who happens to be his comrade, being dead is not a terrible thing. Yes, we do say that. Then he wouldn't lament him as though he had suffered something terrible. Surely not? Moreover, we also say that such a man is most of all sufficient unto himself for living well, and in contrast to others, has least need of another. True, he said. Then for him it is least terrible to be deprived of a son, or a brother, or money, or of anything else of the sort. Yes, least of all. Then he laments the least, and bears it most gently when some such misfortune overtakes him. Quite so. So, we'd be right in taking out the wailings of renowned men, and we'd give them to women, and not to the serious ones at that, and to all the bad men. Thus, the men, we say, we are rearing for the guardianship of the country, won't be able to stand doing things similar to those such people do. Yes, he said, we would be right. Then, again, we'll ask Homer and the other poets not to make Achilles, son of a goddess, now lying on his side, now again on his belly, and now on his side, then standing upright, roaming distraught along the shore of the unharvested sea. nor taking black ashes in both hands and pouring them over his head, nor crying and lamenting as much as, or in the ways Homer made him do, nor Priam, a near offspring of the gods, entreating and rolling around in dung, calling out to each man by name. And yet far more than this will ask them under no condition to make gods who lament and say, "Ah me, wretched me, ah me, unhappy mother of the best man." But if they do make gods so, at least they shouldn't dare to make so unlikely in imitation of the greatest of the gods, as when he says, "Ah, woe, dear is the man I see with my own eyes being chased around the town, and my heart is grieved," and "Oh, Sarpedon, dearest of men to me, is fated to be vanquished by Patroclus, Menetius' son." For, my dear Adeimantus, if our young should seriously hear such things, and not laugh scornfully at them as unworthy speeches, it's not very likely that any one of them would believe these things to be unworthy of himself, a human being, and would reproach himself for them, if it should enter into his head to say or do any such thing. Rather, with neither shame nor endurance, he would chant many dirges and laments at the slightest sufferings. "What you say is very true," he said. "But that mustn't be, as the argument was just indicating to us. We must be persuaded by it, until someone persuades us with another and finer one. No, it mustn't be. Further, they shouldn't be lovers of laughter either. For when a man lets himself go and laughs mightily, he also seeks a mighty change to accompany his condition. That's my opinion," he said. "If, then, someone makes noteworthy human beings overpowered by laughter, it mustn't be accepted, far less if they are gods. Indeed," he said, "that is far less acceptable. So we won't accept from Homer such things about the gods as unquenchable laughter rose among the immortal gods when they saw Hephaestus hastening breathlessly through the halls. They mustn't be accepted according to your argument. If you want to consider it mine," he said, "at any rate it mustn't be accepted. Further, truth must be taken seriously too. For if what we were just saying was correct, and a lie is really useless to gods and useful to human beings as a form of remedy, it's plain that anything of the sort must be assigned to doctors, while private men must not put their hands to it." "Yes," he said, "it is plain. Then it's appropriate for the rulers, if for anyone at all, to lie for the benefit of the city in cases involving enemies or citizens, while all the rest must not put their hands to anything of the sort. We'll say that for a private man to lie to such rulers is a fault the same as, and even greater than, for a sick man or a man in training not to tell the truth about the affections of his body, to the doctor or the trainer, or for a man not to say to the pilot the things that are concerning the ship and the sailors, lying about how he himself or his fellow sailors are faring." "Very true," he said. "Then if he catches anyone else in the city lying, any one of those who are craftsmen, whether diviner, or doctor of sickness, or carpenter of wood, he'll punish him for introducing a practice as subversive and destructive of a city as of a ship. That is, at least, he said, if deeds are to fulfill speech. And what about this? Won't our youngsters need moderation? Of course. Aren't these the most important elements of moderation for the multitude? Being obedient to the rulers, and being themselves rulers of the pleasures of drink, sex, and eating? They are, at least in my opinion. So I suppose we'll assert that it's fine to say the sort of thing Diomedes says in Homer. Friend, keep quiet and obey my word. And what's connected with this? Breathing might the Achaeans went in silence, afraid of their leaders. And everything else of the sort. Yes, these things are fine. And what about this? Heavy with wine, with eyes of a dog and heart of a deer. And what comes right after? And all the rest of the youthful insolence of private men to rulers that anyone has ever said in speech or in poem. Are they fine things to say? No, they are not fine. I don't suppose they're fit for the young to hear, so far as moderation is concerned. But if they provide some other pleasure, it's no surprise. How does it look to you? As you say, he said. And what about making the wisest of men say that, in his opinion, the finest of all things is when the tables are full of bread and meat, and the wine-bearer draws wine from the bowl, and brings it to pour in the goblets? Do you think that's fit for a young man to hear for his self-mastery? Or this: hunger is the most pitiful way to die and find one's fate? Or Zeus, alone and awake, making plans while the other gods and men sleep, easily forgetting all of them because of sexual desire, and so struck when he sees Hera that he isn't even willing to go into the house, but wants to have intercourse right there on the ground, saying that he wasn't so full of desire even when they first went unto one another, unbeknownst to their dear parents. Nor is Hephaestus' binding of Ares and Aphrodite fit for similar reasons. No, by Zeus, he said, it doesn't look fit to me. But, I said, if there are any speeches and deeds of endurance by famous men in the face of everything, surely they must be seen and heard, such as, smiting his breast, he reproached his heart with word. Endure, heart, you have endured worse before. That's entirely certain, he said. Of course, the men mustn't be allowed to be receivers of gifts or lovers of money. Not at all. Nor must it be sung to them that gifts persuade gods, gifts persuade venerable kings. Nor must Achilles' teacher Phoenix be praised for making a sensible speech and advising him to come to the aid of the Achaeans, provided he gets gifts. But failing gifts, not to desist from wrath. Nor should we think it worthy of Achilles himself. Nor shall we agree that he was such a lover of money as to take gifts from Agamemnon, or again to give up a corpse when getting paid for it, but otherwise not to be willing. It's not just in any case, he said, to praise such things. And for Homer's sake, I said, I hesitate to say that it's not holy to say these things against Achilles, and to believe them when said by others. Or, again, to believe that he said to Apollo, "You've hindered me, far darter, most destructive of all gods, and I would revenge myself on you if I had the power." And that he was disobedient to the river, who was a god, and ready to do battle with it. And that he said about the locks concentrated to another river, Spercheius, "To the hero Patroclus I would give my hair to take with him." Although he was a corpse, it must not be believed that he did. The dragging of Hector around Patroclus' tomb, the slaughter in the fire of the men captured alive, will deny that all this is truly told, and will not let our men believe that Achilles, the son of a goddess and Peleus, a most moderate man and third from Zeus, Achilles who was reared by the most wise Chiron, was so full of confusion as to contain within himself two diseases that are opposite to one another: illiberality accompanying love of money on the one hand, and arrogant disdain for gods and human beings on the other. What you say is correct, he said. Then let's not believe it, I said, and let us not believe, or let it be said, that Theseus, Poseidon's son, and Pirithous, Zeus' son, so eagerly undertook terrible rapes, or that any other child of a god and himself a hero would have dared to do terrible and impious deeds such as the current lies accuse them of. Rather, we should compel the poets to deny either that such deeds are theirs, or that they are children of gods, but not to say both, nor to attempt to persuade our youngsters that the gods produce evil, and that heroes are no better than human beings. For, as we were saying before, these things are neither holy nor true. For surely we showed that it's impossible for evil to be produced by gods. Of course. And further, they are harmful to those who hear them. Everyone will be sympathetic with himself when he is bad, persuaded that after all similar things are done, and were done even by the close relations of gods, near to Zeus, whose altar to patriarchal Zeus is on Ida's peak in the ether, and in them the blood of demons has not yet faded. On that account such tales must cease, for fear that they sow a strong proclivity for badness in our young." "Entirely so," he said. "So," I said, "what form of speeches still remains for which we are to define the sort of thing that must and must not be said? It has been stated how gods must be spoken about, and demons and heroes and Hades' domain. Most certainly. Wouldn't it be human beings who remain? Plainly. Well, my friend, it's impossible for us to arrange that at present. Why? Because I suppose we'll say that what both poets and prose writers say concerning the most important things about human beings is bad. That many happy men are unjust, and many wretched ones just, and that doing injustice is profitable if one gets away with it. But justice is someone else's good, and one's own loss. We'll forbid them to say such things, and order them to sing and to tell tales about the opposites of these things. Or don't you suppose so?" "I know it quite well," he said. "Then, if you were to agree that what I say is correct, wouldn't I say you've agreed about what we've been looking for all along?" "Your supposition is correct," he said. "Won't we come to an agreement that such speeches must be made about human beings when we find out what sort of a thing justice is, and how it by nature profits the man who possesses it, whether he seems to be just or not?" "Very true," he said. "So then let that be the end of what has to do with speeches. After this, I suppose style must be considered, and then we'll have made a complete consideration of what must be said, and how it must be said." And Adeimantus said, "I don't understand what you mean." "But you just have to," I said. "Perhaps you'll grasp it better in this way. Isn't everything that's said by tellers of tales or poets a narrative of what has come to pass, what is, or what is going to be? What else could it be?" he said. "Now, don't they accomplish this with a narrative that is either simple or produced by imitation, or by both together? I need," he said, "a still clearer understanding of this as well." "I seem to be a ridiculous teacher, and an unclear one," I said. "So, just like men who are incompetent at speaking, instead of speaking about the whole in general, I'll cut off a part, and with it, attempt to make plain to you what I want. Tell me, do you know the first things in the Iliad, where the poet tells of Chryses begging Agamemnon to ransom his daughter, and Agamemnon's harshness, and Chryses calling down curses from the god on the Achaeans when he failed?" "I do." "Then you know that up to these lines, 'And he entreated all the Achaeans, but especially Atreus, 2 sons, the marshallers of the host.' The poet himself speaks and doesn't attempt to turn our thought elsewhere, as though someone other than he were speaking. But in what follows, he speaks as though he himself were Chryses, and tries as hard as he can to make it seem to us that it's not Homer speaking, but the priest, an old man. And in this way, he made pretty nearly all the rest of the narrative about the events in Ilium, as well as about those in Ithaca, and the whole Odyssey." "Most certainly," he said. "Isn't it narrative when he gives all the speeches, and also what comes between the speeches?" "Of course. But when he gives a speech as though he were someone else, won't we say that he then likens his own style as much as possible to that of the man he has announced as the speaker?" "We'll say that, surely." Isn't likening himself to someone else, either in voice or in looks, the same as imitating the man he likens himself to? "Surely." Then, in this case, it seems, he and the other poets use imitation in making their narrative. "Most certainly." If the poet nowhere hid himself, his poetic work and narrative as a whole would have taken place without imitation. So that you won't say you don't understand again, I'll tell you how this would be. If Homer said that Chryses came bringing ransom for his daughter and as a supplicant to the Achaeans, especially to the king, and after that didn't speak as though he had become Chryses, but still as Homer, you know that it wouldn't be imitation, but simple narrative. It would be something like this. I'll speak without meter, I'm not poetic. The priest came and prayed that the gods grant them the capture of Troy and their own safety. and that they accept compensation and free his daughter out of reverence for the god. When he had said this, the others there showed pious respect and consented. But Agamemnon was angry and ordered him to leave immediately, and not to come back again, or else his scepter and the gods' chaplets wouldn't protect him. Before his daughter would be freed, he said she'd grow old with him in Argos. He ordered him to go away and not provoke him if he wished to get home safely. The old man heard and was frightened. He went away in silence. But when he had withdrawn from the camp, he made a great prayer to Apollo, calling upon the god with his special names, reminding him and asking a return if anything he had ever given had been pleasing, whether it was in the building of temples or the sacrifice of victims. In return for them, he called down the god's arrows on the Achaeans in payment for his tears. That, my comrade, I said, is the way simple narrative without imitation comes to pass. I understand, he said. Now, I said, understand that the opposite of this comes to pass when someone takes out the poet's connections between the speeches and leaves the exchanges. That I understand too, he said. That's the way it is with tragedies. Your supposition is most correct, I said. And now I suppose I can make plain to you what I couldn't before. Of poetry and tale-telling, one kind proceeds wholly by imitation, as you say, tragedy and comedy, another by the poet's own report. This, of course, you would find especially in dithyrambs, and still another by both. This is found in epic poetry and many other places too, if you understand me. Now, he said, I grasp what you wanted to say then. And remember, too, that before this we asserted that what must be said had already been stated, but that how it must be said had still to be considered. I do remember. Now, this is exactly what I meant. We must come to an agreement as to whether we'll let the poets make their narratives for us by imitation, or whether they are to imitate some things and not others, and what sort belongs to each group, or whether they are not to imitate at all. I divine, he said, that you're considering whether we'll admit tragedy and comedy into the city or not. Perhaps, I said, and perhaps something still more than this. You see, I myself really don't know yet. But wherever the argument like a wind tends, thither must we go. What you say is fine, he said. Now, Adeimantus, reflect on whether our guardians ought to be imitators or not. Or does this follow from what went before, that each one would do a fine job in one activity, but not in many, and if he should try to put his hand to many, he would surely fail of attaining fame in all? Of course, that's what would happen. Doesn't the same argument also hold for imitation? The same man isn't able to imitate many things as well as one. No, he isn't. Then, he'll hardly pursue any of the noteworthy activities while at the same time imitating many things and being a skilled imitator. For even in two kinds of imitation that seem close to one another, like writing comedy and tragedy, the same men aren't capable of producing good imitations in both at the same time. Weren't you just calling these two imitations? I was, and what you say is true. The same men aren't capable of doing both. Nor are they able to be rhapsodes and actors at the same time. True. Nor are the same actors, you know, even able to do both comic and tragic poets. But all these are imitations, aren't they? Yes, they are imitations. Human nature, Adeimantus, looks to me to be minted in even smaller coins than this, so that it is unable either to make a fine imitation of many things, or to do the things themselves of which the imitations are in fact only likenesses. Very true, he said. If, then, we are to preserve the first argument, that our guardians must give up all other crafts, and very precisely be craftsmen of the city's freedom, and practice nothing other than what tends to it, they also mustn't do or imitate anything else. And if they do imitate, they must imitate what's appropriate to them from childhood. Men who are courageous, moderate, holy, free, and everything of the sort. And what is slavish or anything else shameful, they must neither do nor be clever at imitating. so that they won't get a taste for the being from its imitation. Or haven't you observed that imitations, if they are practiced continually from youth onwards, become established as habits and nature in body and sounds and in thought? Quite so, he said. So then, I said, we won't allow those whom we claim we care for, and who must themselves become good men to imitate women, since they are men, either a young woman or an older one, or one who's abusing her husband, or one who's striving with gods and boasting because she supposes herself to be happy, or one who's caught in the grip of misfortune, mourning and wailing, and will be far from needing one who's sick or in love or in labor. That's entirely certain, he said. Nor must they in any event imitate slaves, women or men who are doing the slavish things. No, they mustn't. Nor, as it seems, bad men who are cowards and doing the opposite of what we just now said, insulting and making fun of one another, and using shameful language, drunk or sober, or committing the other faults that such men commit against themselves and others in speeches and deeds. Nor do I suppose they should be accustomed to likening themselves to madmen, in speeches or in deeds. For although they must know both mad and worthless men and women, they must neither do nor imitate anything of theirs. Very true, he said. And what about this? I said. Should they imitate smiths at work, or men exercising any other craft? Or men rowing triremes, or calling time to those who do? Or anything that has to do with these things? How could that be, he said, since they won't even be permitted to pay attention to any of these things? And what about this? Horses neighing, bulls lowing, the roaring of rivers, the crashing of the sea, thunder and everything of the sort, will they imitate them? But, he said, they're forbidden to be mad or to liken themselves to the mad. Then, if I understand what you mean, I said, there is a certain form of style and narrative in which the real gentleman narrates whenever he must say something, and again another form, unlike this one, in the man who is by nature and rearing the opposite of this other, always keeps and in which he narrates. Which are they? He said. In my opinion, I said, when the sensible man comes in his narrative to some speech or deed of a good man, he will be willing to report it, as though he himself were that man, and won't be ashamed of such an imitation. He will imitate the good man most, when he is acting steadily and prudently, less and less willingly when he's unsteadied by diseases, loves, drink, or some other misfortune. But when he meets with someone unworthy of himself, he won't be willing seriously to represent himself as an inferior, unless, of course, it's brief. When the man does something good, rather, he'll be ashamed, both because he's unpracticed at imitating such men, and because he can't stand forming himself according to, and fitting himself into, the models of worse men. In his mind, he despises this, unless it's done in play. It's likely, he said. Then won't he use a narration like the one we described a little while ago, concerning Homer's verses? And won't his style participate in both imitation and the other kind of narrative? But there'll be a little bit of imitation and a great deal of speech. Or am I talking nonsense? That, he said, is just the way the model of such a speaker must be. Now then, I said, as for the man who's not of this sort, the more common he is, the more he'll narrate everything and think nothing unworthy of himself. Hence, he'll undertake seriously to imitate in the presence of many everything we were just mentioning. Thunder, the noises of winds, hailstorms, axles and pulleys, the voices of trumpets, flutes, and all the instruments, and even the sound of dogs, sheep, and birds. And this man's whole style will be based on imitation of voice and looks, or else include only a bit of narrative. That, he said, is also the way it must be. Well then, I said, these are the two forms of style I meant. So they are, he said. Then of the two, one involves only small changes, and if someone assigns the appropriate harmonic mode and rhythm to the style, it turns out that the man who speaks correctly speaks mostly in the same style and in one mode, for the changes are small, and likewise in a similar rhythm. That's exactly the way it is, he said. And what about the form of the other? Doesn't it need the opposites, all modes and all rhythms, if it's going to be spoken in its own way, because it involves all species of changes? Yes, indeed, that's very much the way it is. Do all the poets and the men who say anything fall into one of these patterns of style or the other, or make some mixture of them both? Necessarily, he said. What will we do then, I said. Shall we admit all of them into the city, or one of the unmixed, or the one who is mixed? If my side wins, he said, it will be the unmixed imitator of the decent. However, Adeimantus, the man who is mixed is pleasing, and by far the most pleasing to boys and their teachers, and to the great mob, too, is the man opposed to the one you choose. Yes, he said, he is the most pleasing. But, I said, perhaps you would say he doesn't harmonize with our regime, because there's no double man among us, nor a manifold one, since each man does one thing. No, he doesn't harmonize. Isn't it for this reason that it's only in such a city that we'll find the shoemaker a shoemaker, and not a pilot along with his shoemaking, and the farmer a farmer, and not a judge along with his farming, and the skilled warrior a skilled warrior, and not a money-maker along with his war-making, and so on with them all? True, he said. Now, as it seems, if a man who is able by wisdom to become every sort of thing, and to imitate all things, should come to our city, wishing to make a display of himself and his poems, we would fall on our knees before him as a man sacred, wonderful, and pleasing. But we would say that there is no such man among us in the city, nor is it lawful for such a man to be born there. We would send him to another city, with myrrh poured over his head and crowned with wool, while we ourselves would use a more austere and less pleasing poet and teller of tales for the sake of benefit, one who would imitate the style of the decent man, and would say what he says in those models that we set down as laws at the beginning, when we undertook to educate the soldiers. Indeed, that is what we would do, he said, if it were up to us. Now, my friend, I said, it's likely we are completely finished with that part of music that concerns speeches and tales. What must be told, and how it must be told, have been stated. That's my opinion, too, he said. After that, I said, doesn't what concerns the manner of song and melody remain? Plainly? Couldn't everyone by now discover what we have to say about what they must be, if we're going to remain in accord with what has already been said? And Glaucon laughed out and said, I run the risk of not being included in everyone. At least I'm not at present capable of suggesting what sort of things we must say. However, I've a suspicion. At all events, I said, you are, in the first place, surely capable of saying that melody is composed of three things: speech, harmonic mode, and rhythm. Yes, he said, that I can do. What's speech in it surely doesn't differ from the speech that isn't sung, insofar as it must be spoken according to the same models we prescribed a while ago, and in the same way. True, he said. And further, the harmonic mode and the rhythm must follow the speech. Of course. Moreover, we said there is no further need of wailing and lamentations in speeches. No, there isn't. What are the wailing modes? Tell me, for your musical. The mixed Lydian, he said, and the tight Lydian and some similar ones. Aren't they to be excluded, I said. They're useless even for women who are to be decent, let alone for men. Certainly. Then again, drunkenness, softness, and idleness are most unseemly for guardians. Of course. What modes are soft and suitable for symposia? There are some Ionian, he said, and some Lydian too, which are called slack. Could you, my friend, use them for war-making men? Not at all, he said. So you've probably got the Dorian and the Phrygian left. I don't know the modes, I said. Just leave that mode which would appropriately imitate the sounds and accents of a man who is courageous in warlike deeds and every violent work, and who in failure, or when going to face wounds or death, or falling into some other disaster, in the face of all these things, stands up firmly and patiently against chance. And, again, leave another mode for a man who performs a peaceful deed, one that is not violent but voluntary, either persuading someone of something and making a request, whether a god by prayer or a human being by instruction and exhortation, or, on the contrary, holding himself in check for someone else who makes a request, or instructs him, or persuades him to change, and as a result acting intelligently, not behaving arrogantly, but in all these things acting moderately and in measure, and being content with the consequences. These two modes, a violent one and a voluntary one, which will produce the finest imitation of the sounds of unfortunate and fortunate, moderate and courageous men, leave these. You're asking me to leave none other than those I was just speaking of. Then, I said, there'll be no need of many-toned or panharmonic instruments for our songs and melodies. It doesn't look like it to me, he said. Then we'll not support the craftsmen who make lutes, harps, and all the instruments that are many-stringed and play many modes. It doesn't look like we will, he said. And what about this? Will you admit flute-makers and flutists into the city? Or isn't the flute the most many-stringed instrument of all, and aren't the panharmonic instruments themselves imitations of it? Plainly, he said. The lyre and the cither are left you as useful for the city, I said. And further, for the country, there'd be a sort of pipe for the herdsman. At least so our argument indicates, he said. It's nothing new we're doing, my friend, I said, in choosing Apollo and Apollo's instruments ahead of Marsyas and his instruments. No, by Zeus, he said, we don't look to me as though we were. And by the dog, I said, unawares we've again purged the city that a while ago we said was luxurious. That's a sign of our moderation, he said. Come then, I said, and let's purge the rest. Now, following on harmonic modes would be our rule about rhythms. We mustn't seek subtle ones nor all sorts of feet, but we'll see which are the rhythms of an orderly and courageous life. And when we have seen them, we'll compel the foot and the tune to follow the speech of such a man, rather than the speech following the foot and the tune. Whatever these rhythms might be is your job to tell, just as with the harmonic modes. But by Zeus, I can't say, he said. There are 3 forms out of which the feet are woven, just as there are 4 for sounds from which all the modes are compounded. This I've observed and could tell. But as to which sort are imitations of which sort of life, I can't say. We'll consult with Damon, too, I said, about which feet are appropriate for illiberality and insolence or madness, and the rest of vice, and which rhythms must be left for their opposites. I think I heard him, but not clearly, naming a certain Enoplian foot, which is a composite, and a dactyl and an heroic. I don't know how, but he arranged it and presented it so that it's equal up and down, passing into a short and a long, and I think he named one iambic and another trochaic, and attached longs and shorts to them. With some of these I think he blamed and praised the tempo of the foot no less than the rhythms themselves. Or so it was the two together, I can't say. But, as I said, let these things be turned over to Damon. To separate them out is no theme for a short argument, or do you think so? Not I, by Zeus. But you are able to determine that grace and gracelessness accompany rhythm and lack of it? Of course. Further, rhythm and the lack of it follow the style, the one likening itself to a fine style, the other to its opposite. And it's the same with harmony and lack of it, provided, that is, rhythm and harmonic mode follow speech, as we were just saying, and not speech them. But of course, he said, they must accompany speech. What about the manner of the style and the speech, I said. Don't they follow the disposition of the soul? Of course. And the rest follow the style? Yes. Hence, good speech, good harmony, good grace, and good rhythm accompany good disposition. Not the folly that we endearingly call good disposition, but that understanding truly trained to a good and fair disposition. That's entirely certain, he said. Mustn't the young pursue them everywhere if they are to do their own work? Indeed, they must be pursued. Surely painting is full of them, as are all crafts of this sort. Weaving is full of them, and so are embroidery, house-building, and also all the crafts that produce the other furnishings. So, furthermore, is the nature of bodies and the rest of what grows. In all of them there is grace or gracelessness. and gracelessness, clumsiness, inharmoniousness are akin to bad speech and bad disposition, while their opposites are akin to and imitations of the opposite, moderate and good disposition. Entirely so, he said. Must we, then, supervise only the poets and compel them to impress the image of the good disposition on their poems, or not to make them among us? Or must we also supervise the other craftsmen and prevent them from impressing this bad disposition, a licentious, illiberal, and graceless one, either on images of animals or on houses or on anything else that their craft produces? And the incapable craftsman we mustn't permit to practice his craft among us, so that our guardians won't be reared on images of vice, as it were on bad grass, every day cropping and grazing on a great deal little by little from many places, and unawares put together some one big bad thing in their soul. Mustn't we, rather, look for those craftsmen whose good natural endowments make them able to track down the nature of what is fine and graceful, so that the young, dwelling, as it were, in a healthy place, will be benefited by everything, and from that place something of the fine works will strike their vision or their hearing, like a breeze bringing health from good places, and beginning in childhood. It will, without their awareness, with the fair speech, lead them to likeness and friendship, as well as accord. In this way, he said, they'd have by far the finest rearing. So, Glaucon, I said, isn't this why the rearing in music is most sovereign? Because rhythm and harmony, most of all, insinuate themselves into the inmost part of the soul, and most vigorously lay hold of it in bringing grace with them. And they make a man graceful if he is correctly reared, if not, the opposite. Furthermore, it is sovereign because the man properly reared on rhythm and harmony would have the sharpest sense for what's been left out, and what isn't a fine product of craft, or what isn't a fine product of nature. And, due to his having the right kind of dislikes, he would praise the fine things, and taking pleasure in them and receiving them into his soul, he would be reared on them and become a gentleman. He would blame and hate the ugly in the right way while he's still young, before he's able to grasp reasonable speech. And when reasonable speech comes, the man who's reared in this way would take most delight in it, recognizing it on account of its being akin. In my opinion, at least, he said, it's for such reasons that there's rearing in music. Then, I said, just as we were competent at reading only when the few letters there are didn't escape us in any of the combinations in which they turn up, and we didn't despise them as not needing to be noticed in either small writing or large, but were eager to make them out everywhere, since we wouldn't be skilled readers before we could do so. True. Now, isn't it also true that if images of writings should appear somewhere, in water or in mirrors, we wouldn't recognize them before we knew the things themselves, but both belong to the same art and discipline? That's entirely certain. So in the name of the gods, is it as I say, we'll never be musical, either ourselves or those whom we say we must educate to be guardians, before we recognize the forms of moderation, courage, liberality, magnificence, and all their kin, and again their opposites, everywhere they turn up, and notice that they are in whatever they are in, both themselves and their images, despising them neither in little nor big things, but believing that they all belong to the same art and discipline? Quite necessarily, he said. Then, I said, if the fine dispositions that are in the soul, and those that agree and accord with them in the form should ever coincide in anyone, with both partaking of the same model, wouldn't that be the fairest sight for him who is able to see? By far. Now the fairest is the most lovable? Of course. It's the musical man who would most of all love such human beings, while if there were one who lacked harmony, he wouldn't love him. No, he wouldn't, he said, at least if there were some defect in the soul. If, however, there were some bodily defect, he'd be patient and would willingly take delight in him. I understand, I said. You have or had such a boy, and I concede your point. But tell me this. Does excessive pleasure have anything in common with moderation? How could it, he said, since it puts men out of their minds no less than pain? But then with the rest of virtue? Nothing at all. But with insolence and licentiousness? Most of all. Can you tell of a greater or keener pleasure than the one connected with sex? I can't, he said, nor a madder one either. Is the naturally right kind of love to love in a moderate and musical way? What's orderly and fine? Quite so, he said. Nothing that's mad or akin to licentiousness must approach the right kind of love? No, it mustn't. Then this pleasure mustn't approach love, and lover and boy who love and are loved in the right way mustn't be partner to it? By Zeus, no, Socrates, he said. This pleasure certainly mustn't approach love. So then, as it seems, you'll set down a law in the city that's being founded, that a lover may kiss, be with, and touch his boy as though he were a son for fair purposes, if he persuades him. But as for the rest, his intercourse with the one for whom he cares will be such that their relationship will never be reputed to go further than this. If not, he'll be subject to blame as unmusical and inexperienced in fair things. Just so, he said. Does it look to you, too, as though our argument concerning music has reached an end? I said. At least it's ended where it ought to end. Surely musical matters should end in love matters that concern the fair. I am in accord, he said. Now, after music, the youths must be trained in gymnastic. Of course. In this, too, they must then receive a precise training from childhood throughout life. And it would, I believe, be something like this, and you consider it too. It doesn't look to me as though it's a sound body that by its virtue makes the soul good, but the opposite. A good soul by its own virtue makes the body as good as it can be. How does it look to you? It looks that way to me too, he said. If we gave adequate care to the intellect and turned over to it the concern for the precise details about the body, while we, so as not to talk too much, showed the way only to the models, would we be doing the right thing? Most certainly. Now we said that they must keep away from drunkenness. Surely it's more permissible for anyone other than a guardian to be drunk and not to know where on earth he is. It's ridiculous, he said, if the guardian needs a guardian. Now what about food? For the men are champions in the greatest contest, aren't they? Yes. Then would the habit of the ordinary athlete be proper for them? Perhaps. But, I said, this is a sort of sleepy habit, and not a very steady one so far as health is concerned. Or don't you see that they sleep their life away? And if they depart a bit from their fixed way of life, these athletes get very critically ill? I do see that. There's need then, I said, for a subtler exercise for these combatants in war, since they must be sleepless like hounds, see and hear as sharply as possible, and in their campaigns undergo many changes of water, food, the sun's heat, and winds without being too highly tuned for steadiness and health. It looks like it to me. Would the best gymnastic be akin of the simple music we were describing a little while ago? How do you mean? A simple and decent gymnastic, of course, especially in matters of war. How would it be? From Homer, too, I said. One could learn things very much of this sort. For you know that, during the campaign, at the feasts of the heroes, he doesn't feast them on fish, and that, although they are by the sea at the Hellespont, nor on boiled meats, but only roasted, which would be especially easy for soldiers to come by, for, so to speak, everywhere it's easier to come by the use of fire alone than to carry pots around. Quite so. Nor does Homer, I believe, ever make mention of sweets. Don't even the other athletes know that if a body is going to be in good shape, it must keep away from everything of the sort? Yes, he said, and they are right in knowing it and keeping away. My friend, you don't seem to recommend a Syracusan table and Sicilian refinement at cooking, if you think this is right. No, I think not. Then you also blame a Corinthian girl's being the mistress of men who are going to have good bodies? That's entirely certain. And the reputed joys of Attic cakes? Necessarily. In likening such food and such a way of life as a whole to melodies and songs written in the panharmonic mode and with all rhythms, we would make a correct likeness, I suppose. Of course. Just as refinement there gave birth to licentiousness, does it give birth to illness here? And just as simplicity in music produced moderation in souls, does it in gymnastic produce health in bodies? That's very true, he said. When licentiousness and illness multiply in a city, aren't many courts and hospitals opened, and are the arts of the law, court, and medicine full of pride, when even many free men take them very seriously? How could it turn out differently? Will you be able to produce a greater sign of a bad and base education in a city than its needing eminent doctors and judges, not only for the common folk and the manual artisans, but also for those who pretend to have been reared in a free fashion? Or doesn't it seem base, and a great sign of lack of education, to be compelled, because of a shortage at home, to use a justice imported from others who are thus masters and umpires? Certainly, he said, basest of all. In your opinion, is this really baser, I said, than when someone not only wastes most of his life in courtrooms defending and accusing, but from inexperience in fair things, is also persuaded to pride himself on this very thing, because he is clever at doing injustice and competent at practicing every dodge, escaping through every loophole by writhing and twisting, and thereby not paying the penalty, and all this for the sake of little and worthless things, ignorant of how much finer and better it is to arrange his life so as to have no need of a dozing judge? No, he said, but this case is even baser than the other one. And, I said, needing medicine, not because one has met with wounds or some of the seasonal maladies, but as a result of idleness and a way of life such as we described, full of humors and winds like a marsh, compelling the subtle Asclepiads to give names like flatulences and catarrhs to diseases. Doesn't that seem base? Quite so, he said. How truly new and strange are these names for diseases. Such, I said, as didn't exist in the time of Asclepius, as I suppose. I infer this from the fact that at Troy his sons didn't blame the woman who gave the wounded Eurypylus Pramnian wine to drink with a great deal of barley and grated cheese sprinkled on it, and it's just these that are thought to be inflammatory. Nor did they criticize Patroclus, who was healing. But for all of that, he said, the drink is certainly strange for one in that condition. No, it isn't, I said. If only you recognize that this current art of medicine, which is an education in disease, was not used by the Asclepiads of former times, or so they say, until Erodicus came on the scene. He was a gymnastic master, and became sickly. So he mixed gymnastic with medicine, and he first and foremost worried himself to death, then many others afterwards. In what way? He said. He drew out his death, I said, attending the mortal disease. He wasn't able to cure it, I suppose, and spent his whole life treating it with no leisure for anything else, mightily distressed if he departed a bit from his accustomed regimen. So, finding it hard to die, thanks to his wisdom, he came to an old age. Well, he said, that was a fine prize he won for his art. Such as is fitting, I said. For one who didn't know that it wasn't from ignorance or inexperience in this form of medicine that Asclepius didn't reveal it to his offspring, but rather because he knew that for all men obedient to good laws, a certain job has been assigned to each in the city, at which he is compelled to work, and no one has the leisure to be sick throughout life and treat himself. It's laughable that we recognize this for the craftsman, while for the rich and reputed, happy we don't. How's that? He said. A carpenter, I said, when he's sick, thinks fit to drink some medicine from the doctor and vomit up his disease, or have it purged out from below, or submit to burning or cutting and be rid of it. If someone prescribes a lengthy regimen for him, putting bandages around his head and what goes with them, he soon says that he has no leisure to be sick, nor his life thus spent, paying attention to a disease while neglecting the work at hand of any profit. And with that he says goodbye to such a doctor, and returns to his accustomed regimen, regaining his health. He lives minding his own business. If his body is inadequate to bearing up under it, he dies and is rid of his troubles. For this kind of man, at least, he said, it's thought proper to use medicine in this way. Is it, I said, because he had a definite job, and if he couldn't do it, it would be of no profit to go on living? Plainly, he said. While the rich man, as we claim, has no such job at hand that makes his life unlivable if he's compelled to keep away from it. At least there's not said to be. That, I said, is because you don't listen to how Phokylides says that when someone already has a livelihood, he must practice virtue. I, for my part, he said, suppose he must also do so before that. Let's not fight with him about that, I said. But let's instruct ourselves as to whether the rich man must practice it, and whether life is unlivable for the one who doesn't practice it, or whether care of sickness is a hindrance in paying attention to carpentry and the other arts, but doesn't hinder Phokylides' exhortation. Yes, by Zeus, he said, this excessive care of the body, if it's over and above gymnastic, hinders it just about more than anything. And it's troublesome in the management of a household, on a campaign, and in sedentary offices in the city. But most important of all, surely, is that it also makes any kind of learning, thought, or meditation by oneself hard. It is always on the lookout for tensions and spinning in the head, and holds philosophy to blame. So that wherever virtue is practiced and made to undergo scrutiny in this way, this care of the body is in every way a hindrance. It always makes one suppose he's sick and never cease to take pains about his body. Quite likely, he said. Then won't we say that Asclepius, too, knew this and revealed an art of medicine for those whose bodies are by nature and regimen in a healthy condition, but have some distinct and definite disease in them? His medicine is for these men in this condition, with drugs and cutting to drive out the diseases. He prescribed their customary regimen so as not to harm the city's affairs. But with bodies diseased through and through, he made no attempt by regimens, drawing off a bit at one time, pouring in a bit at another, to make a lengthy and bad life for a human being, and have him produce offspring likely to be such as he. He didn't think he should care for the man who's not able to live in his established round, on the grounds that he's of no profit to himself or to the city. You speak, he said, of a statesman like Asclepius. Plainly, I said. And don't you see that his sons, because he was like that, both showed themselves to be good men in the war at Troy, and made use of the art of medicine in the way I say? Or don't you remember that as well from the wound Pandarus inflicted on Menelaus? They sucked out the blood, and sprinkled gentle drugs on it, and that after this they didn't prescribe what he must drink or eat any more than with Eurypylus, believing the drugs to be sufficient to cure men who before their wounds were healthy and orderly in their regimen, even if they should happen to take a drink mixed with barley, cheese, and wine right away. And as for those with the naturally sickly and licentious body, they thought that living is of no profit either to themselves or others, that the art shouldn't be applied to them, and that they mustn't be treated, not even if they were richer than Midas. You speak, he said, of quite subtle sons of Asclepius. It's appropriate, I said, and yet it's in just this that the tragic poets as well as Pindar don't obey us. Although they claim Asclepius was the son of Apollo, they also say he was persuaded by gold to cure a rich man, who was as good as dead, and it's for this that he was struck with a thunderbolt. But we, in accord with what was said before, won't believe both things from them. Rather, if he was a god's son, we'll say he wasn't basely greedy, and if he was basely greedy, he wasn't a god's son. Quite right in that, he said. But what do you say about this, Socrates? Won't we need to get good doctors in the city? And, of course, those who have handled the most healthy men and the most sick ones would be the best, and the best judges, similarly, would be those who have been familiar with all sorts of natures. Yes, indeed, I mean good ones, I said. But do you know whom I consider to be such? I would if you'd tell me, he said. Well, I'll try, I said. However, you asked about dissimilar matters in the same speech. How's that, he said. Doctors, I said, would prove cleverest if, beginning in childhood, in addition to learning the art, they should be familiar with very many and very bad bodies, and should themselves suffer all diseases and not be quite healthy by nature. For I don't suppose they care for a body with a body. In that case, it wouldn't be possible for the bodies themselves ever to be or to have been bad, but for a body with a soul. And it's not possible for a soul to have been and to be bad and to care for anything well. Correct, he said. A judge, on the other hand, my friend, rules a soul with a soul, and it's not possible for it to have been reared and been familiar with bad souls from youth on, and to have gone through the list of all unjust deeds, and to have committed them itself, so as to be sharp at inferring from itself the unjust deeds of others, like diseases in the body. Rather, it must have been inexperienced and untainted by bad dispositions when it was young, if as a fine and good soul, it's going to make healthy judgments about what is just. This is exactly why decent men, when they are young, look as though they were innocents, and easily deceived by unjust men, because they have in themselves no patterns of affections similar to those of bad men. Yes, indeed, he said, this is the very thing that happens to them. That, you see, is why, I said. The good judge must not be young, but old, a late learner of what injustice is. He must not have become aware of it as kindred, dwelling in his own soul. Rather, having studied it as something alien in alien souls over a long time, he has become thoroughly aware of how it is naturally bad, having made use of knowledge, not his own personal experience. Well, he said, a judge who's like that seems to be most noble. And good too, I said, which is what you asked. The man who has a good soul is good. That clever and suspicious man, the one who has himself done many unjust things, and supposes he's a master criminal and wise, looks clever, because he is on his guard, when he keeps company with his likes, taking his bearings by the patterns within himself. But when he has contact with good men who are older, he now looks stupid, distrustful out of season, and ignorant of a healthy disposition, because he does not possess a pattern for such a man. But since he meets bad men more often than good ones, he seems to be rather more wise than unlearned, both to himself and to others. That is, he said, quite certainly true. Then it's not in such a man that the good and wise judge must be looked for, but in the former, I said. For badness would never know virtue and itself, while virtue in an educated nature will in time gain a knowledge of both itself and badness simultaneously. This man, in my opinion, and not the bad one, becomes wise. And I, he said, share your opinion. Will you set down a law in the city providing as well for an art of medicine, such as we described, along with such an art of judging, which will care for those of your citizens who have good natures in body and soul, while as for those who haven't, they'll let die the ones whose bodies are such, and the ones whose souls have bad natures and are incurable, they themselves will kill? Well, he said, that's the way it looked best for those who undergo it and for the city. Then your young, I said, will plainly beware of falling into need of the judge's art, since they use that simple music which we claimed engenders moderation. Of course, he said. Won't the musical man hunt for a gymnastic by following these same tracks, and if he wishes, catch it, so that he will require no art of medicine except in case of necessity? That's my opinion. Moreover, he'll undergo these very exercises and labors, looking less to strength than to the spirited part of his nature, and for the purpose of arousing it, unlike the other kinds of contestants who treat diets and labors as means to force. Quite right, he said. Then, Glaucon, I said, did those who established an education in music and gymnastic do so for other reasons than the one supposed by some, that the latter should care for the body and the former for the soul? For what else, then? He said. It's likely, I said, that they established both chiefly for the soul. How's that? Don't you notice, I said, the turn of mind of those who maintain a lifelong familiarity with gymnastic? but don't touch music, or, again, that of those who do the opposite? What are you talking about? He said. Savageness and hardness on the one hand, I said, softness and tameness on the other. I do notice, he said, that those who make use of unmixed gymnastic turn out more savage than they ought, while those who make use of music become in their turn softer than is fine for them. And surely, I said, the savage stems from the spirited part of their nature, which, if rightly trained, would be courageous, but, if raised to a higher pitch than it ought to have, would be likely to become cruel and harsh. That is my opinion, he said. And what about this? Wouldn't the philosophic nature have the tame, and if it is relaxed somewhat more, would it be softer than it ought to be, while if it is finely reared it would be tame and orderly? That's so. And we do say that the guardians must have both of these two natures. Yes, they must. Then mustn't they be harmonized with one another? Of course. And the soul of the man thus harmonized is moderate and courageous. Certainly. And that of the inharmonious man is cowardly and crude? Of course. Then, when a man gives himself to music and lets the flute play, and pour into his soul through his ears, as it were into a funnel, using those sweet, soft, wailing harmonies we were just speaking of, and spends his whole life humming and exulting in song at first, whatever spiritedness he had, he softened like iron and made useful from having been useless and hard. But when he keeps at it without letting up and charms his spirit, he, as the next step, already begins to melt and liquefy his spirit, until he dissolves it completely and cuts out, as it were, the sinews from his soul, and makes it a feeble warrior. Most certainly, he said. And I said, if from the start he got a spiritless soul from nature, he accomplishes this quickly. But if it's spirited, the spirit is weakened and made temperamental, quickly inflamed by little things and quickly extinguished. Thus these men have become quick-tempered and irritable from having been spirited, and they are filled with discontent. Quite so. Now what about the man who labors a great deal at gymnastic and feasts himself really well but never touches music and philosophy? At first, with his body in good condition, isn't he filled with high thought and spirit, and doesn't he become braver than himself? Very much. But what about when he does nothing else, and never communes with a muse? Even if there was some love of learning in his soul, because it never tastes of any kind of learning or investigation, nor partakes in speech or the rest of music, doesn't it become weak, deaf, and blind, because it isn't awakened or trained, and its perceptions aren't purified? That's so, he said. Then, I suppose, such a man becomes a mythologist, and unmusical. He no longer makes any use of persuasion by means of speech, but goes about everything with force and savageness, like a wild beast, and he lives ignorantly and awkwardly without rhythm or grace. Exactly, he said, that's the way it is. Now, I, for one, would assert that some god gave two arts to human beings for these two things, as it seems, music and gymnastic, for the spirited and the philosophic, not for soul and body, except incidentally, but rather for these two. He did so in order that they might be harmonized with one another, by being tuned to the proper degree of tension and relaxation. Yes, it does seem so, he said. Then the man who makes the finest mixture of gymnastic with music and brings them to his soul, in the most proper measure, is the one of whom we would most correctly say that he is the most perfectly musical and well harmonized, far more so than of the man who tunes the strings to one another. That's fitting, Socrates, he said. Won't we also always need some such man as overseer in the city, Glaucon, if the regime is going to be saved? Indeed, we will need him more than anything. These, then, would be the models of education and rearing. Why should one go through the dances of such men, and the hunts, chases, gymnastic contests, and horse races? It's pretty plain, surely, that they must follow these models, and they are no longer difficult to discover. Perhaps, he said, they aren't. All right, I said. After that, what would it be that we must determine? Isn't it who among these men will rule and who be ruled? Of course. That the rulers must be older and the ruled younger is plain, isn't it? Yes, it is. And that they must be the best among them? That's plain too. And the best of the farmers, aren't they the most skillful at farming? Yes. Now, since they must be the best of the guardians, mustn't they be the most skillful at guarding the city? Yes. Mustn't they, to begin with, be prudent in such matters, as well as powerful? And moreover, mustn't they care for the city? That's so. A man would care most for that which he happened to love. Necessarily. And wouldn't he surely love something most when he believed that the same things are advantageous to it and to himself? And when he supposed that if it did well, he too himself would do well along with it, and if it didn't, neither would he? That's so, he said. Then we must select from the other guardians the sort of men who, upon our consideration, from everything in their lives, look as if they were entirely eager to do what they believe to be advantageous to the city, and would in no way be willing to do what is not. Yes, he said, they would be suitable. Then, in my opinion, they must be watched at every age to see if they are skillful guardians of this conviction, and never under the influence of wizardry or force forget, and thus banish the opinion that one must do what is best for the city. What do you mean by banishment? He said. I'll tell you, I said. It looks to me as though an opinion departs from our minds either willingly or unwillingly. The departure of the false opinion from the man who learns otherwise is willing, that of every true opinion is unwilling. I understand the case of the willing departure, he said, but I need to learn about the unwilling. What, I said, don't you too believe that human beings are unwillingly deprived of good things and willingly of bad ones? Or isn't being deceived about the truth bad, and to have the truth good? Or isn't it your opinion that to opine the things that are is to have the truth? What you say is correct, he said, and in my opinion men are unwillingly deprived of true opinion. Don't they suffer this by being robbed, bewitched by wizards, or forced? Now I don't understand again, he said. I'm afraid I am speaking in the tragic way, I said. By the robbed, I mean those who are persuaded to change and those who forget, because in the one case time, in the other speech, takes away their opinions unawares. Now you surely understand? Yes. And then by the forced, I mean those whom some grief or pain causes to change their opinions. I understand that too, he said, and what you say is correct. And further, the bewitched you too, I suppose, would say are those who change their opinions, either because they are charmed by pleasure or terrified by some fear. Yes, he said, that's because everything that deceives seems to bewitch. Now then, as I said a while ago, we must look for some men who are the best guardians of their conviction, that they must do what on each occasion seems best for the city. So we must watch them straight from childhood by setting them at tasks in which a man would most likely forget and be deceived out of such a conviction. And the man who has a memory and is hard to deceive must be chosen. And the one who's not must be rejected, mustn't he? Yes. And again they must be set to labors, pains, and contests, in which these same things must be watched. Correct, he said. Then, I said, we must also make them a competition for the third form, wizardry, and we must look on. Just as they lead colts to noises and confusions and observe if they're fearful, so these men, when they are young, must be brought to terrors, and then cast in turn into pleasures, testing them far more than gold in fire. If a man appears hard to bewitch, and graceful in everything, a good guardian of himself and the music he was learning, proving himself to possess rhythm and harmony on all these occasions, such a man would certainly be most useful to himself and the city. And the one who on each occasion, among the children and youths and among the men, is tested and comes through untainted, must be appointed ruler of the city and guardian. And he must be given honors, both while living and when dead. and must be allotted the greatest prizes in burial and the other memorials. And the man who's not of this sort must be rejected. The selection and appointment of the rulers and guardians is, in my opinion, Glaucon, I said, something like this, not described precisely, but by way of a model. That, he said, is the way it looks to me too. Isn't it then truly most correct to call these men complete guardians? They can guard over enemies from without and friends from within, so that the ones will not wish to do harm and the others will be unable to. The young whom we were calling guardians up to now, we shall call auxiliaries and helpers of the ruler's convictions. In my opinion, he said, that is what they should be called. Could we, I said, somehow contrive one of those lies that come into being in case of need, of which we were just now speaking, some one noble lie to persuade, in the best case, even the rulers, but if not them, the rest of the city? What sort of a thing, he said. Nothing new, I said, but a Phoenician thing, which has already happened in many places before, as the poets assert and have caused others to believe, but one that has not happened in our time, and I don't know if it could, one that requires a great deal of persuasion. How like a man who's hesitant to speak you are, he said. You'll think my hesitation quite appropriate too, I said, when I do speak. Speak, he said, and don't be afraid. I shall speak. And yet, I don't know what I'll use for daring or speeches in telling it, and I'll attempt to persuade first the rulers and the soldiers, then the rest of the city, that the rearing and education we gave them were like dreams. They only thought they were undergoing all that was happening to them, while in truth, at that time they were under the earth within, being fashioned and reared themselves, and their arms and other tools being crafted. When the job had been completely finished, then the earth, which is their mother, sent them up. And now, as though the land they are in were a mother and nurse, they must plan for and defend it, if anyone attacks, and they must think of the other citizens as brothers and born of the earth. It wasn't, he said, for nothing that you were for so long ashamed to tell the lie. It was indeed appropriate, I said. All the same, hear out the rest of the tale. All of you in the city are certainly brothers, we shall say to them in telling the tale. But the god, in fashioning those of you who are competent to rule, mixed gold in at their birth. This is why they are most honored in auxiliaries, silver and iron and bronze in the farmers and the other craftsmen. So because you're all related, although for the most part you'll produce offspring like yourselves, it sometimes happens that a silver child will be born from a golden parent, a golden child from a silver parent, and similarly all the others from each other. Hence, the god commands the rulers first and foremost to be of nothing such good guardians, and to keep over nothing so careful a watch as the children, seeing which of these metals is mixed in their souls. And if a child of theirs should be born with an admixture of bronze or iron, by no manner of means are they to take pity on it, but shall assign the proper value to its nature, and thrust it out among the craftsmen or the farmers. And again, if from these men one should naturally grow who has an admixture of gold or silver, they will honor such ones and lead them up, some to the guardian group, others to the auxiliary, believing that there is an oracle that the city will be destroyed when an iron or bronze man is its guardian. So, have you some device for persuading them of this tale? None at all, he said. For these men themselves, however, for their sons and their successors, and the rest of the human beings who come afterwards. Well, even that would be good for making them care more for the city and one another, I said. For I understand pretty much what you mean. Well then, this will go where the report of men shall lead it. And when we have armed these earth-born men, let's bring them forth led by the rulers. When they've come, let them look out for the fairest place in the city for a military camp, from which they could most control those within, if anyone were not willing to obey the laws, and ward off those from without, if an enemy, like a wolf, should attack the flock. When they have made the camp, and sacrificed to whom they ought, let them make sleeping places. Or how should it be? Like that, he said. Won't these places be such as to provide adequate shelter in both winter and summer? Yes, of course, he said, for you seem to me to mean houses. Yes, I said, those of soldiers, not money-makers. How, he said, do you mean to distinguish the one from the other? I shall try to tell you, I said. Surely, the most terrible and shameful thing of all is for shepherds to rear dogs as auxiliaries for the flocks, in such a way that due to licentiousness, hunger, or some other bad habit, they themselves undertake to do harm to the sheep and, instead of dogs, become like wolves. Terrible, he said. Of course. Mustn't we in every way guard against the auxiliaries doing anything like that to the citizens, since they are stronger than they, becoming like savage masters instead of well-meaning allies? Yes, he said, we must. And wouldn't they have been provided with the greatest safeguard if they have been really finely educated? But they have been, he said. And I said, it's not fit to be too sure about that, my dear Glaucon. However, it is fit to be sure about what we were saying a while ago, that they must get the right education, whatever it is, if they're going to have what's most important for being tame with each other and those who are guarded by them. That's right, he said. Now, some intelligent man would say that, in addition to this education, they must be provided with houses and other property, such as not to prevent them from being the best possible guardians, and not to rouse them up to do harm to the other citizens. And he'll speak the truth. Well then, I said, see if this is the way they must live, and be housed, if they're going to be such men. First, no one will possess any private property, except for what's entirely necessary. Second, no one will have any house or storeroom into which everyone who wishes cannot come. The sustenance, as much as is needed by moderate and courageous men who are champions of war, they'll receive, in fixed installments from the other citizens, as a wage for their guarding, in such quantity that there will be no surplus for them in a year, and no lack either. They'll go regularly to mess together like soldiers in a camp, and live a life in common. We'll tell them that gold and silver of a divine sort from the gods they have in their soul always, and have no further need of the human sort. Nor is it wholly to pollute the possession of the former by mixing it with the possession of the mortal sort, because many unholy things have been done for the sake of the currency of the many, while theirs is untainted. But for them alone of those in the city, it is not lawful to handle and to touch gold and silver, nor to go under the same roof with it, nor to hang it from their persons, nor to drink from silver or gold, and thus they would save themselves, as well as save the city. Whenever they'll possess private land, houses, and currency, they'll be householders and farmers instead of guardians. And they'll become masters and enemies instead of allies of the other citizens, hating and being hated, plotting and being plotted against. They'll lead their whole lives, far more afraid of the enemies within than those without. Then they themselves, as well as the rest of the city, are already rushing toward a destruction that lies very near. So, for all these reasons, I said, let's say that the guardians must be provided with houses and the rest in this way. And we shall set this down as a law, shall we not? Certainly, said Glaucon.